Welcome everyone to this special Goldster event, an author to author with Dr. Harlan Ullman in Washington, DC. Harlan is a senior advisor to the Atlantic Council and has many similar hats and has had over a long career, and he's also the author of many books. And his latest, out in the United Kingdom just last week, is called The Fifth Horseman and the New MAD. Now, many of us will record the concept of mutually assured destruction during the Cold War, which prevented war, we thought, because neither side wanted global annihilation. Harlan's MAD stands for massive attacks of disruption, such as COVID, the insurrection a year ago to topple the American government, cyber attacks, climate, and now, of course, Ukraine and an unpredictable Russia, where, ironically, nuclear weapons have once again become an issue. Welcome, Dr. Harlan Ullman, to Goldster Author to Author. We're very privileged to have you, and thank you for making the time to come here. Welcome, Harlan.
Humphrey, it's always a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. It's great for you to be here. And do ask Harlan anything you want, comment any way you want. Nobody knows what is going on at the moment with Ukraine, and that's what we hope to discuss and get an insight into. Now, you wrote The Fifth Horseman before February the 24th this year and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but you created at the beginning a fictional scenario of a presidential inauguration in 2029, that's just 7 years from now. And in it, you say Vladimir Putin celebrated his 77th birthday in the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, after Russia's de facto annexation of the country. How did you know that?
I didn't. But I used the introduction. The interesting part about that, Humphrey, is that it starts out with the inauguration at an undisclosed location, because the first woman president of the United States has no White House to go to because it's been destroyed by a terrorist American group called Destroy America Now, or the DANS, destroyed by drones. And so she's living in what would be a concrete iceberg. The White House is now located well below the surface because of security reasons. And I just played out how things could go wrong. And it plays out that NATO is in disarray. Putin has done very well for himself, similarly with China, that North Korea has finally absorbed South Korea. Taiwan has become part of the mainland, or different directions. Not that these things will happen, but I really want to frighten the reader to understand that this notion of new MAD, and let me make a point here, step back. During the Cold War, with tens of thousands of thermonuclear weapons, and let me just say a thermonuclear weapon is 1,000 times more powerful than a nuclear weapon. No one died under a nuclear cloud. But with COVID, in America, nearly 1 million Americans have died from COVID. That's more than every American who was killed on a battlefield since 1775. And yet we don't take massive attacks of disruption all that seriously. We look at these things as singular events. It might be cyber, jamming the pipeline, the Colonial Pipeline, so gasoline was cut off northeast part of the United States. It could be further cyber attacks. It could be bad weather. But you have to look at these things comprehensively because they're all reinforcing, and we haven't done that. And quite frankly, what's happening in Ukraine is a horrible example of disruption. About 25% of the Ukrainian people have been disrupted and forced to leave their homes. The refugees that are pouring into Western Europe are huge and are straining the system. And when Putin suggests he may use nuclear weapons, he is trying to disrupt NATO. He's trying to disrupt the United States and seize the initiative. Now, obviously, whatever Putin did was not necessarily part of massive attacks of disruption, but it certainly illustrates the problems we face across the board of all of society. And I guess it was an unlucky guess that I portrayed Mr. Putin in Kyiv in 2029, taking over the country. One hopes that that's not going to happen this time, but at this stage, it's really too early to tell how the conflict in Ukraine is likely to unfold, except the one thing we do know is that the people who are bearing this horrible burden are Ukrainians and Russians. and things will be much, much worse in Ukraine, and things will be much, much worse in Russia, no matter what happens. That's the only thing that we really know about this conflict so far.
I mean, you've given us an array of disruptive things that are going on, and Ukraine is obviously at the forefront of all our minds, but interlinked, as you sort of said, the weakness that he perceives of Europe and NATO and all the rest of it that you put in your book. But given the euphoria that swept through most of the democratic world, most of the world actually, in the 1990s with the collapse of communism, what did we do wrong? What did we do that created this situation? Or was it unavoidable that you would have got a Putin-like character running Russia, whatever happened at our end?
I dissect that rather well in the book. In a chapter when I take a look at inflection points. Is this 1914, the start of World War I, or 1918, the end of the war? Is this 1939 or 1945? Is this 1991 or is this 2001? And I argued this is more 1914, 1939, 2001, and the start of an era that's going to be very, very difficult because of these disruptions. Look, Putin has no excuse for what he's done. It's obscene, it's horrible, it's terror. But the saying goes that paranoids often have enemies, and we have to realize that we contributed to this. It began in 1991 with the fall of the Soviet Union, and then the arrival of Bill Clinton as president, because one of Clinton's priorities was to expand NATO. And unfortunately, the expansion of NATO now to 30 countries has been a huge provocation to Russians, and we should have known better. I argued against the huge expansion of NATO. This has been a huge problem. But since Clinton, every single president has made huge mistakes that contributed. George W. Bush made two profound errors that were irreversible. Three, actually. Okay. First, he did not heed Putin's advice about going into Afghanistan. Putin warned him. The Russians were there for almost a decade and left. They got beat. And we were there for a decade and we got beat. Bush would not listen to him. Second, Bush went into Iraq in 2003, which was a strategic catastrophe that really upended the Middle East and set Putin on his way. Then in 2007, Putin laid out the Munich Security Conference, his list of grievances. And then in 2008, at the NATO summit in Bucharest, Romania, I was there. On a whimsy, George W. Bush said, and of course, Ukraine and Georgia can join NATO at some stage. And unfortunately, because the NATO alliance did not want to offend Bush, they were all horrified when he said that, in large part because NATO refused to grant membership action plan to both Ukraine and Georgia. This was a throwaway line, came out of nowhere. It was recorded in the official documents and the record. Putin was there and Putin was furious and went up to Bush and used the same statement that Bush's father used when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990. He said, George, this will not stand. And Bush put his arm around Putin and said, look, Vlad, come on. It's just something I said, don't worry about it. And Putin said, I am worrying about it. And several months later, provoked Georgia and their president Saakashvili to do something really stupid, after which the Russians retaliated. And now they have South Ossetia. And so we have provoked. We also were instrumental in canceling any number of treaties. The Immediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, the Iran nuclear deal, open skies. And we did, and Bush canceled the anti-ballistic missile treaty, announcing he would do in 2001. We've done all these things, Humphrey, that have helped to alienate Russia. And unfortunately, I think we've done them more out of ignorance. But the fact is, and this is a horrible statement, where we are is where we are. You can't undo the past. And Putin does have genuine grievances against us, but none of which rise to the occasion of permitting an obscene invasion unprovoked against a country that was minding its own business, except having the misfortune of being situated adjacent to Russia.
I'd just like to settle for a moment on what I'm saying, the tin ear of leaders in the West, because you, as a young man in your 20s, when you were a naval combatant in Vietnam, was summoned to the White House to brief President Lyndon Johnson on what was going on there, and you were expected to tell him that everything was going well. But you actually spoke truth to power in the way and said it wasn't going well, and nobody listened. And throughout your career, you've just chronicled, and you chronicle in The Fifth Horseman, about not listening to obvious things. So at what stage, or had NATO, the West, the US ever listened to the Russian grievances, ever taken them on board, or something that had to be negotiated around?
Well, actually, we've tried. But the trouble is we tried in terms of what the West thought would be successful. For example, we created the special agreement between NATO and Russia,
right?
The Founding Act. And then in 2002, we created the NATO-Russia Council. That was to make Russia not part of NATO, but certainly within NATO. And we thought all those things were sufficient. And then we decided we were going to deploy anti-ballistic missiles to Poland and Romania, which infuriated and scared the Russians, because they thought that these systems could be used not against their strategic systems, but against their shorter range nuclear systems. And we said, no, this is against Iran. Well, that was crazy as far as the Russians were concerned, because first of all, Iran does not have nuclear weapons. And second, it didn't have a ballistic missile capable of carrying these things. And so they saw all this as a screen and believed, because Russians tend to be paranoid, that this was directed against Russia. And from their view in Moscow, look, there are 30 NATO members. NATO spends, pick a number, 10 or 15 times as much on defense as Russia does. The population of NATO is 5 or 6 or 8 times larger than Russia's population. In every single category of conventional forces, NATO outnumbers Russia by 3 to 1, 4 to 1, 5 to 1. We have 25,000 fighters, they've got 5,000. So from their perspective, they saw themselves being outnumbered. They never fully trusted the West, with good reasons. And they also felt that they were being surrounded. And so from Russia's perspective, everything we tried to do was just wrong. We never fully understood it. And one of the, or I should say, two of the most profound issues that we face in America as a democracy. First, the last really competent president we elected was George H.W. Bush. Right. The successive presidents lacked the judgment, the experience, and the background. Now, Joe Biden should have reversed that.
He should have the experience.
He was chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. He was chairman of the Judiciary Committee. Yeah. He was vice president for 8 years. But unfortunately, his administration, as other administrations, lacked the knowledge and understanding of other people. Yeah. This is one of the reasons why we lost in Vietnam. This is one of the reasons why we got the Middle East wrong. We tend to think that people either reason like us or they're in need of education to bring them up to our level. And that's been a profound problem with the United States, not understanding other societies, other cultures, and thinking what we knew about the United States applies elsewhere. It's one of the things intellectually and creatively wise that's gotten us into trouble. And unfortunately, the Biden administration, in my view, has fallen prey to the same malaise.
I want to move, not move, but we have a question in which brings us to one of the disruptions that you were mentioning and how this goes in. And to John Simpson of the BBC, this is from Angie, John Simpson of the BBC offered the analysis that because of COVID, and it said that Putin has a pathological terror of the virus, he has spent the past 2 years surrounded only by sycophantic advisors who tell him only what he wants to hear. So COVID has played a contributory role, along with other factors that you rightly identify. The isolation has amplified his paranoia. Do you go along with that, Harlan?
Absolutely not. Look, you've seen Putin meeting. He sits at a long table.
Yeah.
Because he's afraid of a Stauffenberg Oslovsky. You all know about von Stauffenberg and Hitler.
Right. Yes.
That's the reason he sits at the end of a desk. Believe me.
It's not about COVID.
That's not. I mean, we know so little. We are ignorant about Putin. Part of my book, one of the chapters, or 3 of the chapters, are on Putin and Xi.
Yeah.
And it goes back to his millennial
Xi,
speech.
meaning Xi Jinping of China.
2000.
Yeah.
And he's met every single leader who's come to meet him.
Yeah.
They don't sit at the far end of the table. He shakes their hand, brings them into the presidential office. So
Yeah.
COVID had absolutely nothing to do with it. This is one of the myths that arise, just like people think that Putin is insane. Unfortunately, he's not. I was wrong. I won't say the first time, but I didn't think Putin would be stupid enough to go into Ukraine. And I said so, because it would ruin all his objectives for a new security framework in Europe, keeping Ukraine out of NATO and preventing NATO expansion. The opposite is going to happen. Ukraine's not going to go into NATO, but NATO is going to move much closer to Russia. Having gone in, he's going to double down. This is a battle of wills. And where we are behind, he has the initiative. What we should be doing, for example, we should be, and we've been slow rolling Ukraine. We're talking about all the stuff that's going to Ukraine. Look, this goes back to the Trump administration, where Trump cut off aid to Ukraine because I want to ask a favor of President Zelensky. Yeah. So this is a bipartisan favor. Why does Ukraine not have anti-ship missiles? Why is Ukraine not sinking the British or the Black Sea Fleet? Question mark. Mm-hmm. That's not escalatory. That's called self-defense. Mm-hmm. And why have we not done a really good analysis, or perhaps we have, of all the weaknesses that Russia has and sending the stuff that can disrupt Russia, more than just stingers and javelins and all the things that are going on.
And you're talking about now. You're not talking about how we could have prepared Ukraine for this. You're talking about what we should be doing now?
Absolutely, what we should have been doing from the start.
Okay.
Look, nobody thought Putin was going to do this. Looking back in history, you can say to Franklin Roosevelt, why didn't you move the battleships out of Pearl Harbor? How could you be so stupid? But at that stage, when the enemy has a vote and the enemy can take the initiative, and every single sneak attack that an enemy has launched throughout history has succeeded, even though they may have lost a war. And right. Putin's attack on Ukraine was a sneak attack, even though he was mounting. A number of people just didn't think he was going to do that.
We've got a comparative question here, but before we go to that, I just want you, could you just outline right now what we, NATO, whatever you want to call it, should be giving Ukraine that we're not?
Well, I think that first of all, longer range precision fires. One of the reasons why Ukraine wants MiG-29s is not to combat Russian airplanes. It's to take on Russian firepower systems, artillery and rockets that outgun and outrange what Ukraine has. So Russia's getting a free ride. Their guns shoot further. And so Ukraine has got to change that. We need to give them more standoff stuff that can attack Russian artillery. We need to define who the Russian commanders are and provide as much information and intelligence to Ukraine so they can decapitate the leadership. They should have a targeting program to kill all the colonels and the generals and the lieutenant colonels. And we can help them do that. Cut off the head of the leadership, and we have the capacity. Anti-ship missiles make it expensive for the Russian fleet to come close to Odessa or Mariupol. We haven't done that. Or sea mines, weapons like that.
And why haven't we done that? Why haven't we done that?
The White House is afraid of escalation.
I thought the red line of escalation was NATO troops in Ukraine or no-fly zone, not sending weapons. Sending weapons seems to be okay.
No, the MiG-29s were called provocative. Putin is defining what the red lines are and not. We should have been far more aggressive from the very, very beginning. Okay. Now I can understand. I think that most people thought, and I did, that Putin would have been in Kyiv weeks ago.
Yeah.
So the resistance of the Ukrainians, I think, surprised, shocked, and awed everybody. But when it appeared that they were doing better, we should have opened the floodgates. And quite frankly, we were slow to do that. Now there are issues of classification. Do we want to send them weapon systems that they fell into Russian hands? They could be used against us. We can fix all that. And they don't have to be American systems. For example, the Norwegians have a terrific anti-ship missile called the Penguin.
Okay.
Why can't those be shipped over? Because they're not difficult to learn to use. There are things that we have got to do to take the initiative away from Mr. Putin. We need to be more aggressive in our information strategies, using Telegraph, which is a social media that's useful in Russia. I don't know what our information warfare campaigns are, but I don't think we've been doing well enough. We have to let me put it this way, and I made this point today to a European ambassador here. NATO is in the emergency room. Let me say that again. NATO is in the emergency room over Ukraine, and
Right.
most people don't understand that. We're
Right.
being far, and I'm not saying be terribly aggressive and go to war. We have to realize that this is the crisis of our generation. We have to be far more innovative and creative and understanding the ways that we can make life difficult for the Russians, not simply by sanctions, which don't work for the short term. And when they do work, they're going to affect the Russian people. And by the way, since the 24th of February, how much revenues in euros has Russia received for gas and oil? Over 18 billion euros.
Yeah.
And so, all right, that gas and oil is needed in Western Europe, but we have to be more creative. And when Putin draws a red line, we ought to say nonsense.
Yeah.
We ought to say nonsense. For example, supposing he uses chemical weapons.
Mm-hmm.
President Biden says that's going to be really serious.
Yeah.
I'd go a step further. I would make it known that the US military today has the capacity to take out, not quite instantaneously, but in a very short time, virtually all the logistics and command and control points that Russia has in Ukraine.
Yeah.
I'm not saying we do that, but I would say that somebody might leak a story to the New York Times saying, by the way, do you know this is a capacity that US has? Or for example, I would have the Supreme Commander, Allied Commander in Europe, who's also the commander of European Command, to stand up and say, the story that I have been delegated a Trident ballistic missile submarine under my operational command is untrue. The Russians will not believe that. The Russians will say, oh my God, these guys are serious. We have to understand how Russians think, and we have been bad at that. We have been bad at that. And I think that Ukraine should be doing things like putting bounties on the heads of every Russian officer above a major.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Let's terrorize them.
Yeah.
Let's terrorize.
And you mentioned the intelligence sharing a moment ago. They have killed a number of generals and commanders, haven't
Not
they?
enough.
Not enough. But has that been the intelligence sharing from NATO? Have they pinpointed them?
The answer is I don't know. I think one of the larger problems is that the whole command and control system of Russia has been completely disrupted. And I think generals and colonels are saying, go to the front, you got to take charge, because we don't have communications. They've taken away our cell phones. And when we do go to communications, they jam them or they hear them. So you got to lead from the front. That would be my guess. And I suspect that we are getting some good targeting information, but we still don't know the name of the general who's in overall command. Right. And I think when we do, we ought to say he's a war criminal and there's a bounty on his head.
Yeah. Suri says here, President Kennedy was infuriated when the USSR was shipping missiles to Cuba. Is Putin not in the same predicament with NATO's expansion eastward? Is this comparative?
No. I mean, you can make a distance analogy. I mean, obviously, Putin has been taken very seriously, as Russia has, about NATO's expansion eastward, because they see it as a real threat, and we rejected that. As I noted in my book, The Fifth Horseman, we started the Cuban Missile Crisis. Nobody wants to admit that. Jack Kennedy came into office claiming there was a missile gap and saying, we'll pay any price, bear any burden, and I'm going to strengthen defense. I'm going to send 3 additional defense supplemental bills to Congress. I'm going to send the forces into Cuba to invade it, and I'm going to triple the size of my strategic nuclear forces. Here's poor Khrushchev, who has been trying to take money away from the defense side so that the civilian sector can finally enter into the 19th century, let alone the 20th century. He knows that there is a huge missile gap. The Russians basically have nothing, and we have everything, but we didn't know how big the gap was. And so Khrushchev, to save his domestic program, said, okay, what am I going to do? The Americans have Jupiter missiles and Turkey short-range ballistic missiles. I've got a lot of short-range ballistic missiles. It will save me the money of building long ones. I will put them into Cuba. It'll be a fait accompli. I will bypass their strategic advantage. Kennedy will buckle, because when I met him in Vienna in June, he's got no backbone and everything will be great. Well, Kennedy didn't buckle, but Khrushchev was forced to do what he did.
So Suri is right in a way. There are sort of comparisons, and that is pushing the Soviet Union or pushing Russia into what they think is a corner, so they then lash back.
No, I don't think that's an excuse. Look, what Khrushchev did from his perspective was rational. He thought he could have his cake in essence and eat it.
Right.
What Putin has done is an unprovoked attack.
Yes, because he's
an unprovoked attack in which he is destroying a country.
Yeah.
There's no parallel there with Cuba, except to
And-
the degree we went in with the Bay of Pigs, but I don't think we would have destroyed Havana.
Sir, this is an interesting point. Surya says Hemingway, and for whom the bell tolls, quotes that in seeking safety, we create danger. Is this your point, your Biden point here, that in not going far enough, we're making it more dangerous?
No, my point is the only really good piece that Hemingway ever wrote, in my judgment, was The Short Happy Life of Francis Macomber.
Yeah.
And the theme of the book is a guy who's very weak, married to this stunning gal, goes on safari, and the great white hunter seduces this guy's wife.
Yeah.
And so he does it after they're attacked by a raging lion or whatever. And this poor guy runs away. And that's what his wife says, that's it. So he responds the next day when he's being charged by a wild elephant to stand his ground. And his wife so panics to try to save him, she shoots him and kills him possibly accidentally.
Right.
That's a better situation that you get into a position where you're so humiliated.
Yeah.
This is Putin, who's been humiliated for 20 years, and just read everything he said.
Yeah.
In his view, we have disrespected him. We've treated him as he's nothing. We've disrespected Russia. So in essence, he is Francis Macomber, who resentful about being humiliated and then tries to transform himself.
You wrote in one of your recent columns, Ukraine's strategy must emulate Churchill, and though those costs will be considerable. Let's go back to the ground on Ukraine now, what we were talking about before. How considerable, and how much do they have to actually emulate Churchill? Because that's a big emulation given the cyber, the nuclear, and all of those threats that are around at the moment.
This could be a fight to the death.
What, a world war fight to the death?
No, a fight to the death in Ukraine between Ukraine and Russia.
Well, Russia will win that.
Which side gives up?
Russia
Look,
will win.
A quarter of the Ukrainian population, plus or minus, has been disrupted and has moved.
Yeah.
10% maybe is out of the country, mostly women, old men, and children. Mm-hmm. They have got to make Russia bleed more than they can bleed. And I put in my column Monday, they win as the North Vietnamese won and the Vietnamese lost by not losing. The North Vietnamese probably never won a single battle. They won the war. Ukraine is winning a lot of battles. They're going to have to persist. They're going to have to make this such a meat grinder that Russia over time is going to say, we can't afford this. Now, there are estimates. Between 7 and 15,000 dead Russians. To give you an idea about how big that is in war, in Iwo Jima, against suicidal resistance,
yes,
in 1945, the U.S. Marine Corps took 7 weeks to the little island to be able to take it over, lost 6,000 dead Marines against suicidal resistance. The Russians are taking possibly 1,000 casualties a day. The Ukrainians are bleeding them. And at some stage, Humphrey, Putin has got to say, wait a minute, we just can't endure it. Now, will that be in a month? I think it may be within 30 days. And so his exit strategy either will be to leave or leave with substantial parts of Ukraine. And as a result, everybody will be dissatisfied with the way that this war ends because they're going to have to give what they thought before were ungivable points.
Does there have to be regime change in Russia? Will Putin have to go? If he loses or is seen to lose by the mothers of the dead soldiers and by his generals and by his economists and people that have lost all the trade, will he have to go? And then what happens?
Well, I don't think he will go. Remember, it took 2 years for the Russians or the Soviets to get rid of Khrushchev after the Bay of Pigs in October '62. Putin controls the media. He will proclaim a great victory. He will say, we've done enough. We've saved Russians. We've achieved our point. We've been able to do this. He'll give away a lot of medals. They'll do something to free up money in the environment, which will provoke the economy, that will provoke inflation. But this will be terrific. There'll be victory parades on May Day. Think about our gallant heroes, and they'll try and paper this over. But that's going to be a huge problem, because I think we will have shattered the Russian economy sufficiently that there are going to be two huge issues. Will the Russian economy recover? Question mark. And how long?
Mhm.
And second, who's going to rebuild Ukraine? Those are going to be two looming issues.
Mhm.
And if for some insane reason Putin decides to use chemical weapons, or heaven forbid a nuclear weapon, the damage will be irreversible.
Yeah.
I don't know how we fix that.
And then you have the Iron Curtain coming down again, don't you? Because there's
It's
no
a
way
nuclear curtain.
Hmm?
It's a nuclear curtain. And if he uses chemical weapons, I think we have no choice but to respond. Similarly with nuclear weapons. And the way that we respond, we just take out the Russian military in Ukraine and
Yeah.
say, okay, we want the next step.
Yeah.
I don't think we'll do that. I don't think we'll have the courage to do that. And I understand it. I'm not president.
Hmm.
I'm pontificating from a long way away.
Well, as you're
And I'm
pontificating,
entitled to my opinions,
Yeah.
but the country will be hugely divided. I think we have to stand up. There are lots of reasons. I don't believe, by the way, that Putin is going to move into NATO. He may do some things that are provocative. For example, you will have read about cruise missiles wandering to other territories, cruise missiles that passed into Poland and into Romania.
Yeah.
So he could do something, a cruise missile got out of hand and it managed to explode on top of a Polish tank or something like that, to be provocative. But I don't think he's going to use chemical weapons. And if he uses nuclear weapons, guess where the fallout goes? Over Russia and
Yes.
China.
Yeah.
And I don't know how China would be able to tolerate.
I want to move.
nuclear
I want to
weapons.
move on to China in just a second, but Angie has got a question here that we're sort of addressing, so I'll ask it. Do you not believe there's any option for a diplomatic solution, even if it involves ceding certain of the southeastern provinces to Putin with resettlement of the population? Escalation into warfare seems the worst possible option if talks and compromise could eventually work. Is that possible, or has it gone too far?
It's the only option.
It is the option. Yeah, go on.
It is the option. Look, the other option is that Russia mobilizes its entire military. And I think their military is overstretched right now. I think if Putin wanted to move into Poland or the Baltics, he does not have the capacity. So the only option is a diplomatic option. And the only way we're going to get that is to bleed the Russians to the point where they have no other choice. But how this ends, if Russia were to try to occupy Ukraine, or even the parts that it now has, it doesn't have enough forces to do that.
And
would be a guerrilla
it'll face
war.
an insurgency?
Of course. Look,
Yeah.
if you go by standard figures, it would take roughly 400,000, 500,000 troops to occupy, including police, to occupy a country the size of Ukraine. We couldn't do it in Afghanistan. We couldn't do it in Iraq.
Yeah.
So he's got a huge problem. And even he keeps part of Donbass and a corridor, there are going to be huge problems there. And he's going to have to keep a huge military there as well. So yes, the only solution is a diplomatic solution. But how do you produce enough shock and awe to force one? Or what do you use to compel or cajole or convince or coerce the Russians to the point where they see a diplomatic solution is their best
But
option?
is there not all? Is there not also another problem there? Is that if there is a solution, everybody signs up to it. There will be an insurgency. Does NATO continue to, or Western countries continue to help those people?
Of course.
I mean, how does that work?
I have no idea. I mean
it's a big problem, isn't it?
This is the problem from hell. This is the problem you get at war colleges to frustrate the students because they can't solve it. I mean, these are sorts of war problems. When I was teaching at the National War College and the Naval War College, these are the sort of the problems we give, which are unsolvable.
Yes.
And this problem right now is about as unsolvable. Look, World War II, unconditional surrender, and we frankly built more ships than Germany had torpedoes.
And we had the nuclear weapon too. So
at the end, but I'm talking about the war in Europe. We outgunned.
Yeah.
We crushed militarily.
Yeah.
The German army. We overwhelmed them. I mean, we're turning out destroyers in a couple of weeks, airplanes every day or so. I mean, the amount of stuff we turned out during World War II is unbelievable. We just overwhelmed the bad guys. And then, of course, we had nuclear weapons to force the Japanese to surrender, which was remarkable because they were suicidal. And one of the reasons I developed shock and awe was because overnight, 2 bombs, and it took the second bomb to force the Japanese to realize this was not good, because they could not comprehend how one airplane would have the equivalent firepower of 1,000 bombers.
Just
That's why
explain
shocking
to,
was important, and that's what I want to turn on Putin to convince him that this is not worth it. That's why I want to sink the Black Sea Fleet.
yeah. Explain shock and awe, because you devised that phrase back in '95, I think it was, but explain it to our audience of how you came up with it, what the doctrine is and where it applies now. Shock and awe, which we hear about.
The idea was we put together a group. This was during the Clinton administration because we were unhappy with the Clinton administration's defense policies. And we put together basically the guys who fought and won Desert Storm, the air war commander, the ground commander, one of the operational commanders. And the idea was, could we have defeated Saddam Hussein basically without having to go to a military war?
Right.
How could we possibly shock him and awe him? And the whole idea was to affect, influence, and control will and perception, to put him in such a position that he was impotent. He could do nothing. He couldn't control the environment. He could only do what we wanted. And one of the things we would have done was to coerce the Iraqi military to turn against it, which we were trying to do. And we tried to do it in 2003, but the Bush administration just didn't listen. So the idea was to take basic Sun Tzu, the famous Chinese military philosopher in general, winning war is about deception, and how can you win without fighting? That was shock and awe. To so overwhelm an enemy that the enemy came convinced that there was nothing that he could do, she could do, that they were entirely vulnerable. And so when people talk about shock and awe, this is not overwhelming force. It's the exact opposite. That's the shock and awe that we were proposing.
Okay, that's Jean Joyce asks, what do you think the future of Russia looks like? A lot of the world won't trust Putin or deal with him. I want to get onto Sun Tzu and China after you've answered this question, because it sort of goes there.
Well, let me make two comments. First, the future for Russia. No, the future for Russians is grim, Mm-hmm. And I, as a recovering Sovietologist, I have no idea how this is going to turn out. I don't know who would replace Putin and whether that person would be any better than Putin. I will say that there's not a single finger on the Russian so-called nuclear button. There are at least 3 or 4 fingers: the president, the minister of defense, the chief of the general staff, and the strategic rocket troop. So I don't think.
If Putin ordered a nuclear strike, tactical or whatever, would his generals follow him?
I don't know, but don't assume it would.
Yeah.
Don't assume it would, because he does not. He can't push a button and say go. He would have to get the support of his generals. Three
other people at least. Suri asks, is it true that Putin threatens to invade Sweden and Finland if they join NATO?
They've made threats, but they had a very unhappy experience with the Finns in the war, and he does not have the troops to do that. That's nonsense, and we should be saying that's nonsense. We should be saying you're already exhausted. You're already exhausted in Ukraine. We should be playing a propaganda warfare. You're going to the front, poor Russians, you're dead. You're doomed. That's why I like the idea of bounties.
I just wanted you to talk about propaganda then. A question I was going to ask you earlier when we were talking about Vietnam and the situation here. There are 2 differences, aren't there? One is that in this war, Putin can control the narrative, as it were, which America couldn't do on Vietnam, because that war was won, as I said, in the living rooms, not on the battlefield of the people turning against him. But the other difference is that the Vietnam War didn't really impact on the US economy, but it is going to crush, this war is going to crush the Russian economy.
No, Humphrey. The US economy
did it tank?
Huge trouble, you bet.
But not like the Russians, not queues at bread.
No, but we remember the misery index under Jimmy Carter. That was a direct function of the Vietnam War, where you had interest rates of 10% and inflation of 12%. It impacted the American economy. Not so much as what's going to happen to the Russian economy. Okay, well, we have to think about that. We don't want to have Germany in 1918 recreated.
You mean with Russia now? You don't want to have that happen.
And this is very delicate. For example, I mean, I cited the point that the Europeans are buying huge amounts of gas and oil from Russia. But the Russians are important to us, so Iran does not get a nuclear weapon. Now, how do you balance that?
Yeah.
My argument is that Iran not getting a nuclear weapon in many ways may be worth a partition of Ukraine, as harsh as that sounds. But how do you make that case?
Yeah.
How do you make that case? Because the opponents are going to say, well, the Iranians can always cheat. Well, the fact of the matter is they didn't cheat. And the fact of the matter is we had the most intrusive surveillance system to ensure they can't cheat. But this was unfortunately, look, one of the greatest disruptors I write about in the book is failed and failing government.
Right.
Biden talks about autocracies versus democracies. That's nonsense. I shouldn't say that's nonsense. In my mind, that's a false argument. The problem with democracies is their governments are not working. The problem is we have failed and failing governments, not democracy. That's not the issue. We have to understand we got to get things working here. I'll give you an example, Humphrey. Last week, the US Senate unanimously, or through unanimous consent, passed a bill in which daylight savings time was established universally. All right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That would have been catastrophic because unfortunately, America is a huge country and time zones in Seattle, Washington, and Miami, Florida reflect different forms of geography in North and South. Mm-hmm. And so if you put in the daylight saving times permanently, you'd have kids going to school when it's pitch black, 9 o'clock in the morning on the West Coast.
That's what they do in China. They have one time zone, don't they?
I understand. Yeah. And that is really stupid. That's what Congress was able to pass. And right now they're having these hearings on Judge Jackson for the Supreme Court Associate Justice, which are disgraceful, quite frankly, because the Republicans are trying to get even for the disgraceful conduct that the Democrats displayed over Judge Kavanaugh and Judge Barrett.
Yes.
And this is how we're working. We don't have a strategy for Ukraine except to watch and let Ukrainians hold the Ukrainian coat while they fight. Why not?
So
failing government is the biggest disruptor we have. Britain, Boris is making a mess of it. Democracies are really working well. Hungary with Orbán.
So can I just nail that down for a second? Because I want to. So the democracies aren't working because the elections are producing not the right leaders or bad leaders.
Absolutely.
And this is the argument that China or the autocracies make. Now, in the Ukraine situation, more and more is saying that China is going to be pivotal. Who's China supporting? You mentioned Sun Tzu, the Chinese strategist who says that you can win a war without a shot being fired.
No, he said that's the preferred option.
Yeah, the option there.
Win without fighting.
Yeah, without fighting, win without fighting. My question here is that by going into Ukraine with such overwhelming force and firepower, yet being an ally of China, is Russia violating that thought of China, or is Russia being the sort of muscle that China needs to make its point?
I think if you ask President Xi, he is deeply embarrassed by this. Yeah. Ukraine is a fiasco, and the Chinese are smart. They know that. But the Chinese are playing the long game. And what President Xi has assumed, and quite frankly, if you read the American press and see how the Congress and the executive are working, America's in decline. Mm-hmm. America is in decline.
But surely then Russia helps it.
And we can fix that. But what President Xi is saying, that my first disruptor, failed and failing government, is precisely what's happening in America. And we cannot let that happen here, which is why he's reinforced the role of the Communist Party. That's why he's taking charge of the elite. That's why he's putting restrictions on the entrepreneurial class, which could be his downfall, because those are the geese that are laying the golden eggs. Mm-hmm. And if you throttle that, then China's economy is going to suffer. And the middle class, or I should say the underclass of possibly 500 million Chinese, are going to be very unhappy. The number one priority of emperors, general secretaries, party leaders, is called stability. That means no peasant revolutions. China right now has hundreds of thousands of large riots a year that are not reported. They're riding a tiger. And Putin, and Xi knows that.
Yeah, so Putin is causing global instability.
Correct.
And therefore, as this plays out, how is China, or will it separate itself from the US? Will it side with the US? I mean,
it will be neutral, but what it's doing right now is letting this play out because what is in its interest to get engaged? It doesn't gain anything from siding more with Russia. It's done so verbally. I don't think it's going to send any military equipment or material like that.
How can
the Americans are suffering? So why should I do anything different? If you were President Xi, why would you change paths right now? Just wait.
So
it's playing the long game.
So how can then China be seen as a global leader if in this very pivotal crisis that we're having, the first of this nature, say in 30 years or so, it doesn't take leadership?
Precisely because of that. What it's saying is that we have a system that's stable, we have a huge economy, and we're going to lead with what we say. And we don't need to exercise global leadership. The last thing we want is a hegemon, as the United States was. In essence, they will say what President Obama said, we're leading from behind. And we'll let our economy do
He did say that. So China's leading from behind. Suri says, is India also not in a similar dilemma? Is called it as China. Is India in a similar position or
no? Because look, India is ungovernable. It's ungovernable for every reason you can imagine. You know, it still has a caste system, even though it won't even admit to it.
Yeah.
And so you don't have a system that's autocratic enough. That's what Prime Minister Modi is trying to do.
Yeah.
And so it is so disaggregated. I mean, you've been there many, many times. India is just this giant so-called democracy that's foundering, and I just don't see that that's going to get any better.
So India's not a player at all in this.
It's a secondary player.
It's a secondary player. And the United Nations vote on it, where you had 141 against Russia, 35 abstentions, and Russia itself only managed to get 5 other votes, which were failing rogue, impoverished states. What does that mean to the way the world is thinking about this? You know, there's tectonic plates, as people call it, moving.
Well, as I write in the book, The Fifth Horseman, there's no such thing as the world.
Okay.
That's a misnomer, Humphrey. It's how various players are seeing it, and then how do you mobilize leadership? And I want to change American strategy dramatically, because I believe that dealing with the Fifth Horseman and massive attacks of disruption requires that our strategy is not one to contain, which you can't, deter, and we're not doing a very good job of deterring China or Russia, or defeat in war, because war could be nuclear and everybody's going to lose. So I argue we need to be able to prevent and contain massive disruption. We need to be able to defend against it and against enemies, and we need to engage. And we have not, frankly, been engaging enough. And when we do engage, it's on our terms. For example, we should never have started a tariff war with China.
Well, that was the American democracy producing a leader that did that. So
no, I would say it presented a president, not a leader.
All right, presented a
but
president.
It goes back to Obama in 2011 when Obama says we're making a pivot to Asia. So what did that do? That angered the Chinese and scared all our allies because it wasn't prepped. And actually, we have a smaller footprint in Asia now that we've made the pivot than we had before.
So I need to sort of nail this down, that the democracies are failing, but how do you fix it in a democratic way?
Well, the way I fix it in the United States is through what I call a national infrastructure investment fund. That's patterned after 1923. In which the Americans entered the greatest economic boom in our history, following, believe it or not, the 1918-1920 Spanish flu. And I have a chapter that compares 1918-20, as you know, with today in the Spanish flu and COVID. The only way we're going to undo this polarization is to improve the living standards for Americans, and that means developing the infrastructure writ large. And I don't just mean roads and highways. I mean, education has got to be turned from basically a 19th century model, maybe a 20th century model, to one that focuses on learning. We need to exploit advanced technologies, artificial intelligence, all the pharmaceutical, medical, all these things, green technologies.
But how will that stop a President Trump or a Boris Johnson? Or
it won't. look, we can't, we're a 50-50 country, and an election in 2022 is going to be even worse than 2020. We can't do that overnight. In the past, and one of the problems is, Humphrey, and I'll get back to the investment fund, our Constitution no longer works. Our Constitution
So that needs to be rewritten.
Why? Yeah. Why? It is based on checks and balances. Yeah. Checks and balances to work, you need at least one of several conditions. First, one party can have a veto-proof majority at both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, the White House, Congress, and 5 votes in the Supreme Court. If you live to be 300, that's not going to happen. Yeah. Second, there can be a crisis like Pearl Harbor that rallies the nation. We had a crisis that killed 4 times as many people so far, 3 times, in World War II. And what did COVID do? It divided the nation. Or you could have civility and compromise and consensus. Look at the hearing today on the Hill for the Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, and what's lacking: consensus, civility. So that's not working. You cannot fix that. If you take this fund, and by the way, it's going to be financed not by the 1.2 trillion that's already been appropriated, which is trivial, but by bonds. You buy a bond at 2% over prime, 30 years, which gives you a payment of 2% over prime for 30 years. And the way you pay for it is not just by user fees and tolls, but during the 2008 financial crisis, the US government put in place something called TARP, Troubled Asset Relief Program, $800 billion. But they were smart, because when they invested in banks, they took something called convertible debt. So when the banks got better, they could cash out their convertible debt for US Yankee dollars. And so for that 800 billion, we probably made 200 billion. So the government can be entrepreneurial. In other words, it invests.
But just to
it's so smart, we can't do it. And by the way, the current $1.2 trillion, who's providing the oversight?
Yeah.
Nobody.
Yeah.
I mean, you got Pete Buttigieg, who's the Secretary of Treasury, and
but this is
needed. Who's the former mayor of New Orleans. There's no oversight. If you bring in civilians and private money, you can bet there's going to be oversight. But this is too clever.
This is needed not just in the US, but it's needed
you do it everywhere.
In Europe, it's needed in Britain, it's going to be needed in Russia, isn't it? Because if Russia was
the way you do it. Yeah. This is the entrepreneurial capitalist model for how you develop your infrastructure and make money at it.
Right.
But look, let me give you something to make everybody laugh. We need a lighter moment. I can fix Congress overnight. One step. You ready? Before every member of Congress votes on a bill, they have got to say that they have read and understood it. I swear or affirm that. The last bill that came out, which was, I don't know how many $1 trillion, came out at 2 o'clock in the morning and was voted upon that same morning. This is insane. And in the United States, where members of Congress said, well, this is just too tough. Yeah. They make 2 points. You're a CEO, chief executive officer of a public company. You've got something that is called the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, in which you can go to jail or you can be indicted for putting out false material. So that if your balance sheet is not correct, technically you could go to jail.
We've got a couple.
And by the way, in 1973, when Don Rumsfeld was Secretary of Defense the first time, and we had 300,000 people fighting in Vietnam in a war, guess how long the defense bill was? 93 pages. How long was the defense authorization bill in the House and the Senate? In the House, it was about 4,500 pages. In the Senate, more than 3,000. This is insanity.
Yeah. Now we've got you said that sort of nitty-gritty of democracy is in trouble. We've got a couple of questions, quick answers, and then I've got to go to what we've got next, and then back to you again. Angie says, overwhelming decisive force, which we've mentioned, in the service of an ultimate diplomatic solution, high risk or not?
I don't know what that means. Who's using the force?
It means the overwhelming decisive force that we were talking about earlier, risking escalation in the service of an ultimate diplomatic solution. Do we need this? It won't work. It won't work. So the negotiations could be done.
It's got to be diplomacy.
It's got to be diplomacy, and that could start now. So you
could have negotiation. It's got to be a non-kinetic, non-forceful way out.
So you could have a ceasefire now and the diplomacy. Simons was, what are your views on Boris Johnson? Give us 30
Boris is a
seconds.
good guy to have a drink with, and I will not comment on the head of another government.
Okay, right. I want you to stay exactly where you are after a couple of seconds. I've got to tell people what we've got coming up next. Then I've got a final question for you, Harlan. Tomorrow, 24th, that is tomorrow at 12 o'clock, we go into psychology and history with Dr. Peter Hughes and his poignantly titled book, The History of Love and Hate in 21 Statues. This is going through why people pull statues down and why they get so obsessed about them. Peter's your man to quiz on that. And Goldster has an exciting new alliance to announce with Aspects of History magazine, which is what Peter is also a member of. And Goldster members are going to be able to get a 50% discount on membership of Aspects of History and all that they have to offer. So there's more to come there. March 25th, that's Friday, a book of the month, the debut novel called The Appeal by Janice Hallett, a totally different sphere we're in now. There is a mystery to solve in the small town of Lockwood, and it starts with the arrival of two secretive newcomers and ends with a tragic death and all that unravels from that. It sounds very Agatha Christie to me. And then on March 31st, I am on an inside story with KJ Howe. Kimberly Howe writes thrillers with a tough and complex female lead character, and she is also the chief executive of Thriller Fest, the annual conference that brings together stars like Lee Child, Frederick Forsyth, Peter James, and George Martin, who penned Games of Thrones. Come into that world with me and KJ Howe on March 31st. Harlan, you've never done a thriller, have you? You're all nonfiction.
Well, I've tried a couple novels. I've got one that I'm working on right now, which is really a projection of the 2029 description in the book.
Oh, okay. And you've got a female character there. You've got a female president.
She's going to be president. And,
Yeah.
and the title reverses E Pluribus Unum. It's called Unum E Pluribus, from one many, which talks about how do you prevent the disintegration of the United States, and which will have a great scene of a submarine trying to navigate the Bosphorus to get into the Black Sea to sink one of the bad guys' ships.
And it's the Bosphorus that has been blocked, isn't it, during the Ukraine war by Turkey at the moment? Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And just to say, for those of us who know about Taiwan and Asia, you think that China will be taking over Taiwan?
Well, I say so, and ultimately it will, but I will say what it will not do. China does not have and will never have the amphibious capability to launch a massive amphibious operation against Taiwan that would take hundreds of thousands of troops. They have, however, many, many, many other options, but this is one, such as no-fly zone, that should be taken out of the lexicon because it's nonsense.
Yeah. Okay. And I just wanted to finish with this last question. You talk about you talk about the fifth horseman here of the apocalypse, which we all know about. Explain that, your vision of an apocalypse in all we've been talking about now.
Well, massive attacks of disruption are going to get worse. And in the case of the United States is not going to implode as the Soviet Union did. But life is going to be more difficult unless we take a strain and start acting now. Standards of living are going to decline for virtually everybody except the extreme rich, which will cause even greater political problems. And the American dream will just be postponed so that the majority of Americans will not have the same opportunity that their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents had. Now, that's not a horrible situation, but it's not a good situation. And I think it would suggest an America in decline. We can fix that. And if we can implement what I call the 1923 fund to improve our entire infrastructure writ large, we can reverse that and make this the most competitive country that ever existed. Whether we will have the will and the creativity to do that is the challenge that we face with a constitution that I argue right now is not fit for purpose. And unless or until the political parties do things differently, and I argue in the book what they need to do, unfortunately, the path that we're on is not a very, very optimistic one, but not the end of the world. That's not necessarily a good thing either.
So the nutshell of this, and you're not allowed to contradict me because we've wrapped it up, is that we made a lot of mistakes with the NATO expansion and the triumphalism after the end of the Cold War, and our democracies need to be fixed, constitutions need to be rewritten, and better politicians need to be elected. and that way we can avoid apocalypse. That's it. Harlan Ullman.
Let me just amend that. Let me amend that. That's wishful thinking. We need the fund for infrastructure. That will be the difference.
Oh, and yes, and the infrastructure fund, which of course is, I did say you weren't allowed to contradict me, but of course you can. Thank you, Harlan Ullman, for a very grim topic we had tonight and for taking us deeply behind the scenes there with your insight on it, of the Ukraine crisis. And we hope to have you back maybe a year from now with another book when everything has changed. Thank you, Harlan. Thank you for all at Goldster for keeping the show alive and running. Thank you all for your questions and your comments, and Ernest Hemingway we had in there and everything like that. Until tomorrow morning with Peter Hughes and his love and hate of 21 statues. Stay safe, stay active, stay involved, and bye from now. Bye, Harlan. Good to see you.
Humphrey, thank you.
Thanks.